Welcome back to the Dallas Dreamhack Regional Championship. Mason, we just watched an incredible match between Yeoman and Jack Doucette. We've got some more Magic coming up. We are going to get into a match with Jody Keith on Simic Artifacts, better known as Cookies. And he's going to be up against Steve Gahn on Azorius Control. What do you think about this list here?
Yeah, so this is a deck that, popular MTGA streamer Ash Lizzle has streamed a lot and really promoted. And we've seen people start to pick it up, The deck might be called Cookies, which seems like a bit like a meme, but the deck has some real power to it. And, with the deck used to be a bit more tempo-y, right? And with the addition of OTJ, it's really gone more and it can play games like that, but it's just trying to kind of beat you down and win. And you're going to kind of see that from Jody's deck here. We have some tempo-y cards in our sideboard. We have some spell piercers and stuff like that. But for the most part, Jody is just going to be trying to play a traditional beat down a game here. And one of the nice parts about Jody's deck is it has a decent amount of mana sinks too that are going to be able to get underneath those counter spells and pressure them in weird ways from the blue-white control deck.
Right, so let's take a look at that blue-white list from Steve here. What are your thoughts here? Is this pretty stock blue-white? Do you think Steve's bringing any spice to the table?
Yeah, I mean, all of these decks are kind of like the same 80-ish, 85 cards, and they kind of move around between the sideboard or my maybe box and my main deck, right? So one of the things that Steve did that I really liked with this weekend, main deck Tidebinders, right? That's something we've seen from players. This card is really good in matchups like Analyst, can be really helpful in the mirror where cards like Jace the Perfected Mind are sometimes the game one winning thing. So I like the way Steve has sort of built his deck. In the sideboard, we have the Stoic Sphinx, which is a really nice creature we've seen people pick up as sort of a pivot thing and able to fight a more traditional game in the post board. So I like this control deck. I like that we're sort of, we have like 4 Wandering Emperors, something that we've seen some players go down a little bit on. Makes sense. It's not lined up super well against some of the actual top decks when it comes to percentage wise, but such a powerful card. It's hard for me to want to move away from the 4th. And this looks very well tuned. And obviously, Steve is X&1 coming into day number 2 here in prime position to make it to the Pro Tour, doing incredibly well. And notably for chat, no draws here. From what I'm seeing, Steve, clean, fast blue-white control player. Can't wait to see it.
Yeah, playing at pace, and we are ready for our match. We're going to get into that right now as we see our players getting ready to start the match here. Now, who do you think is favored between these two decks?
That is a tough spot because I think play draw matters a fair bit, but I can imagine this game going kind of long. I think Jody is my pick just because, like I mentioned earlier, cards like Tough Cookie have some nice activated abilities that we can use to pressure Steve on the turns where we're trying to hold up our counter spells and be very efficient in that way. I think Jody also has a bit of advantage that not as many people are used to playing against this deck. So there is some amount of you kind of need to know what's going on.
Right, and we are going to see a Teething Wormlet. And just like you said, people not used to playing against this deck, Steve's going to have to take a look at that one, make sure he understands everything that does. Is a great turn 1 play for Jody here. Steve's just going to play a land and pass as Jody goes to try and cast the Lost Jite, which is going to trigger the Wormlet. It's going to get a counter. Jody's going to gain a little bit of life.
Yeah, and Lost Jite is one of those cards that we saw get previewed with the big score as part of OTJ, and players were like, oh, this is kind of cool. It's a callback to, Umezawa's Jite. But I don't really know, if this is a card I'm actually going to play. And we have seen it come up in fringe spots in various decks throughout Magic. And seeing it here in Standard is great, where I imagine, in this deck, getting to use your mana more because by untapping the lands, make your creatures unblockable, grow them a little. All those things are really big here for the Cookies deck.
Right, and we are going to see that Teething Wormlet get marched as Steve is deducing at the end of Jody's turn here. Gonna draw a card, make a clue.
Yeah, and Deduce is one of those big upgrades for the Azorius control deck that might not look at first glance, because traditionally, when you play against these control decks, you kind of want to strangle their mana on the turns where they're holding up just counterspells, and that's it. And Deduce is a great way to punish you with that. As you do see, Steve tapped out, and Jody slams the Cloak.
Yeah, Cryptic Coat, quite a powerful card here. Looks like it's going to crew the Schooner immediately, which is going to equip the Jite. We're going to have a trigger there, get a land into hand. Steve's going to take some damage. We're going to get a counter on our artifact there. Really powerful turn here for Jody.
Yep. One of the things to keep in mind with the Lost Jete is it does not need to be equipped to activate its ability to untap a land. So Jody is threatening having 1 mana up right now, which for Jody's deck in this matchup doesn't have many things that really matter. But post-board, this play pattern might be something you see a lot of as Jody has access to cards like Spell Pierce.
Absolutely. I'm going to get back over to Steve, who we do see an Emperor in hand there. And it looks like a couple deduces. I think that might be a No More Lies as well. And Temporary Lockdown. Huge card to be playing right now.
Yeah.
Gonna go ahead and activate the Jite, untap the land, and then the just so much of Jody's board gets eaten by the lockdown.
You do see, so the cloaked creature has to be revealed face up. When face down creatures change zones, you have to reveal them. So we weirdly have an instant underneath the temporary lockdown, which does go on my bingo card. I'm 1 away, Niall, so stay ready.
Well, in this match, we might see some more unusual cards under a lockdown. It's like we're bouncing the coat back to hand and replaying it. Gonna cloak another creature. And another deduce at end of turn for Steve. Gonna draw a card and make a clue.
Yeah, and I feel like that's kind of a sign that maybe Jody doesn't have a ton going on, or maybe smells weakness from Steve, where, exposing your cloak to the counterspell there is something that could be very game ending, and kind of tells me Jody either 1 has a read Steve doesn't have something like No More Lies, or 2 is just like, I have no other place. I've just got to do this here. So he's playing his cards a little close to the chest. It's hard to see them right now, but it's an interesting spot for sure. And now Jody has a ton of information. He can lie all he wants.
Yeah. We're going to see a cracking of the clue token. Steve draws a card. Has 4 untapped lands, which is quite nice.
One of the things these blue-white control decks like to do is take their time in winning and, just accrue some cards, make some trades, and eventually kind of win with what's left. Another thing they like to do sometimes is weirdly turn to these like almost tempo-y Delvery decks where they get a threat and they just protect it a bunch. And I think that might be what Steve's trying to set up here, is trying to find a way to like get something into play sooner than later, because the Cryptic Coat is going to accrue a lot of value as the game goes on and be a really troublesome threat.
Right, and this is the one of Cryptic Coat in the main deck for Jody here.
Oh,
we're going to see the Zoetic Glyph come down onto the Cryptic Coat, which will turn it into a 5/4 creature, but that is just going to get marched in response, which very good to handle that on the stack, because otherwise Zoetic Glyph would let you discover 3 when it hits the yard.
Yeah, I like this play a lot from both Steve and Jody, because Jody, once again, we talked about kind of maybe low on things that matter, right? So for Jody, it's like, oh yeah, I just 1 for 1 with you, right? Like, I wanted to get this code back in my hand at some point anyways, and now I got rid of your March, which is one of the more annoying answer spells in your deck for me.
Right, and Steve, living my dream, casting another deduce, getting to draw a card, make another clue, and has 5 mana up.
Sadly for Steve, the last deduce in the deck is played. We're out of deduces. We had them all in like the first 7 turns, but we had them all.
All right, we know Jody has the coat in hand, has the creature land on board. We don't really know what else he's got working in his hand right now, but we do know Steve still has that Wandering Emperor.
And with the coat in hand, it's important to note that, that is a 2/2 with Ward 2, but not unblockable. And you see Jody just slam again.
Right. So we are going to attack in with the creature. Steve's going to think about it.
Yeah, Steve could do something like make a Wandering Emperor and then make a Samurai and offer the block. You can't minus because it has Ward 2. That will get you, but it's available to Steve. Now, notably, the Cryptic Coated Disguise creature is unblockable, so your Emperor would die on the next turn.
Right. But we are going to see the Emperor come down for Steve. Looks like we are making a Samurai.
Looks like Jody's double checking if he wants to respond before anything happens.
Yeah. Not sure. There's not a ton of instant speed interaction for this deck, right?
Yeah, it looks like Jody has hard hitting question in hand, which he can use to then kill off the Emperor. And that's actually really huge for what a massive turn with Agatha's coming down. These are two, like one of those cards you definitely want to sneak in underneath with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. And hard hitting question is a card that theoretically can get value. Like we just saw how it does normally, but it's really hard to have it line up correctly. And having Jody get the ability to do that is massive for his chances of winning, converting these dead cards into real cards.
Yeah, definitely putting Steve in an incredibly awkward spot here. Looks like there's a Tidebinder in hand. Not sure what else.
Agatha's Soul Cauldron is a card, we're very used to seeing in formats like Modern. We're even seeing it pop up in Pioneer a little bit, but that's a different conversation for a different stream. But here in this deck, it has a ton of great activated abilities, Niall. It has Ginger Brute, which, you can give the haste and also the sacrifice to gain 3 life, which sounds like I'm joking, but against cards like Temporary Lockdown, getting that underneath there might mean your next Agatha's Soul Cauldron can eat a different creature. And we have Tough Cookie, which will actually turn our artifacts into these 4/4 big creatures. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where it's like, hey, we have some activated abilities that are going to be huge problems for Steve if the game goes long. And now Jody can run the Tough Cookie into a counter spell. Steve is going to kill it. And then Jody will be like, all right, whatever, give this ability to all my creatures now.
Right. Well, and don't forget the 3 of Surge engine, which can give any of your creatures 1 mana becomes unblockable. Very powerful stuff. But we're going to see the coat get marched there, which finally deals with it. And on Jody's turn, it looks like we're just activating the creature land. And before we attack with it, it is going to get lost.
Yeah, the Vine Stalk, the Oko on a land, as it were, which is the most over-exaggeration I've ever done on coverage. And if you watch my coverage, I've done a lot of them. So congratulations to Vine Stalk for getting that honor. But, Steve taking it down here. And right now, if Steve draws a card like another Temporary Lockdown, I think we're in a great spot. There's only 1 left in the deck, so it's going to be a hard thing to have happen. But we're getting Jody dangerously close because that Cryptic Coat was the thing that was kind of keeping Jody in the game for a while there.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, Steve, life is getting low, but also getting to the point in the game where Azorius control just gets to dictate the game. And we're going to see a Jace Perfected Mind come down for Steve. And looks like we are going to uptick it.
I love this play from both players. So first thing to note, Steve, unfortunately for him, drew a Field of Ruin, which sucks because we had to use the Get Lost in the Vine Stalk last turn, and you'd love to have your fields line up against the creature land. Luckily, Jody has 1 more in the deck, so we are going to get a chance to get it later. 2 more in the deck. But then you see Steve taps out for the Jace and ticks up on the Disguise creature, and Jody says Ward 2, and Steve goes, no. No, I just wanted my loyalty to go up 1. If you missed your trigger, then that was cool. But I got something to do with my mana, and that is sending off alarm bells with Jody, because if Steve didn't have anything, he would gladly pay the 2 mana to remove the pressure on his Planeswalker, right? Like,
yeah,
he's not going to just let that happen when it's going to have pressure on board.
Yeah, and a crack of the map token onto the cloaked creature is going to get a Mirrex into hand for Jody.
That is a big get for Jody, as the Mirrex is one of those great creature adjacent lands that allows you to use your mana underneath the counterspells more and more and grind. Unfortunately for Jody, like we just talked about, Field of Ruin was drawn last turn.
Yeah, definitely beneficial for Steve here. Now we've got multiple Restless Anchorages on the board that can become creatures as needed. We're going to crack another map. This time it's going to hit the Tough Cookie, get a +1/+1 counter on the creature.
Thank you to our judges. If you ever see a white dice, it's +1 counter. If you see a black dice, it's something like loyalty or a charge counter. You know, that's why we use different colors to help differentiate that. It is interesting because Jody could mill the Tough Cookie and then eat it with the Agatha Soul Cauldron, but I guess it's just valuing the actual card, which makes sense, right? We saw how Jody was slamming into counter spells before. Might not have gotten a hand that's come together all too much since then.
Right. And gonna have a quick read of Jace here. Make sure he understands what he's up against if he even wants to be attacking it, and is going to swing into it. No blocks from Steve, it looks like. So I think we are going to pump the token a little more with the Cauldron.
Yep. And Steve just double checking that this is how this works.
Yeah. Might have a piece of interaction that he wants to use.
Yeah, it might be a situation where maybe Steve like is asking like, "Hey, with that target on the stack, if I like exile with March for the like the Agathas, does the +1/+1 counter still hit the board?"
Oh, it's a Tidebinder, of course.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah, I believe Tidebinder, because I believe it's like two different things. What's going to happen is the creature will get exiled, and then the trigger goes on the stack to put the counter. So I think Steve can do that if he's wanting to like remove that creature for future Agathas.
Yes,
which makes sense.
Which very, very powerful. Definitely being rewarded for having those main deck Tidebinders, like you were talking about before the match. You know, being able to permanently lock down this Soul Cauldron for as long as Tidebinder's on the battlefield, very powerful. Looks like we are just getting a little bit of information from the judge here, making sure we understand exactly how this is gonna go down. I think as of right now on the stack, we just have Agatha's targeting the Spyglass Siren in the graveyard. All right, so Mason, at this point in the match, you know, we've talked about how Cookies is kind of tempo, a bit aggressive, and of course, Control wants to be playing the long game, wants to get you late into the game. How do you feel about both these players' chances, given where we're at right now?
It is a really weird and really tough spot because Steve has used a lot of our like cards that go up a card, right? Like we talked about how we got all the deduces, but we still have the 4 deluges, which if the game goes long and there's not an Agatha Soul Cauldron active, we're going to get to use those a lot. You know, you're going to get the first 2 cards no matter what. But part of the problem for Steve right now is his Agathas is in play, which is, you know, pressuring the memory deluges, right? If Steve casts a deluge, it's going to get eaten almost immediately. So he kind of needs to have 11 mana and the ability to spend that 11 mana all in one spot. Steve's deck needs to keep those cards going in order to really, you know, have that chain of events matter. So with that all being said, I think, you know, it is a really tight spot. And if Jody can like maintain the status quo for like a turn or 2 more and kill this Jace, Jody is in an okay-ish spot to win the game, like 55-45, Jody's favor, maybe, you know. But if Steve can answer this, right, and, you know, kind of pull ahead a little bit, I think it starts to swing Steve dramatically. It also matters, you know, does Steve have cards like Deluge? Because one of the things that happens sometimes with these decks is you never draw Deluge, which is unlikely to happen with all the, you know, card selection and things like Jace can mill yourself and draw a card, so it helps you find the Deluges, which, you know, if you did that and then immediately flash it back would be fine. So Steve needs to find something to, you know, really balance things out. And these wrath effects are kind of how Steve normally does that. You know, you play something like Sunfall, like Lockdown, you get a nice 2 for 1, a nice 3 for 1. That puts you up enough cards to kind of draw, go, hit some land drops and be fine. That isn't happening here, as we are having the players talk about what happens if the Spyglass gets Tashana's Tidebinder with the Agathas, how do the triggers work, what does everything go? You which we're going to find out pretty soon here ourselves for the answer. But that is all to say, I think Jody is going to be able to win this if the status quo maintains. So if Steve starts finding cards that can catch him up, it's going to be very bad for Jody.
Yeah, there's definitely a resource disparity here with Jody having 5 cards in hand to Steve's 1 that he's probably about to play. But we've also still got the clue token on board. Jace, as you said, definitely a lot of ways for Steve to catch back up on those resources. All right, so it looks like the Spyglass Siren is exiled, and then with the counter trigger, we are going to Tidebinder it. Jace will take 3. Agatha's Soul Cauldron is shut down for as long as Tidebinder is on the field. Or at least I should say this specific Soul Cauldron.
So it looks like Jody needs to ask another question. And I think this question might be asking, like, if I get rid of this Tidebinder, the Agatha gets its ability back, right? Or maybe there might be some weird interaction where, like, hey, if I were to turn my Agatha Soul Cauldron into a creature, what happens then, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because then it's gaining abilities. And I think the answer to that is it's a layers question, where, like, if you were to give it an ability, it would then have it. So, for example, let's say, like, we had a Tough Cookie activation on it, right? And so then it becomes a 4/4 artifact creature. That doesn't give it any ability, but if it somehow came a food from there, I think you could then sacrifice it. And I imagine that is what Jody is asking. Basically, it's like, if this Tough Cookie comes down and I turn this Agatha into something, 1, it gets its ability, like, it will be something, right? And 2, is there anything else I can do in that regard? Because Tashana's Tidebinder removing text is such a weird thing.
Yeah, and we are going to see a Wormlet come down, and then a Schooner, which is going to trigger the Wormlet. We're going to get that counter, gain that life. Making the lockdown even juicier if we can draw one.
Yeah, I think Jody is just saying I can't beat a lockdown. I've got to fade it. I want to note that Murex is not in play for Jody. I believe that's in his hand.
Yeah.
He just has it face up because it was revealed to a map token. So don't want anyone to be confused. Think there's a Murex activation available, and or that Steve could Field of Ruin it. That is off the table. Well,
Yeah,
it's technically on the table, but it's off the table. So
yeah, we're seeing Steve really think hard about this one. Which is probably a good sign that he has a decision to make.
Yeah, we also have the Restless Anchorages we can start activating as well. Attack, get some map tokens. Looks like Sunfall is one of the cards in hand.
Yeah.
Looks like it was Sunfall Plains.
Yep.
So this is an interesting spot where Steve can Sunfall the board, and then the cookie will come down, and that's going to pressure the Jace. So if Steve does this, the Jace is going to die.
Right. But he can have Jody mill the cookie away with the Jace, which I think might be happening. That's going to be Cookie Zoetic Glyph Cookie.
And Steve does only get to draw 1 card because there weren't 20 cards in Jody's graveyard. But now,
pass.
Yeah, this is interesting because Jody, if he can remove that Tidebinder, he's going to have access to those cookies again. But if he can't, then those cookies are going to be stuck until another Soul Cauldron comes down. But that also means Steve can't really Sunfall yet, because if we do, then the Agatha Soul Cauldron comes back online because the Tidebinder will be gone.
Right. Yeah. So really tricky position to be playing from. But I mean, having those anchorages, I think, helps a lot in terms of defense here. So we're going to go back to Jody, who's going to think a bit about how this turn's going to go down. Looks like we're tapping 3 lands, for a Zoetic Glyph on the Soul Cauldron. That's going to go through.
And I think this is maybe what the Tidebinder question was about before, right? We talked about it like if we gave an ability. Right. I think Jody was asking, hey, if this Agathos dies when it's a Zoetic Glyph, do I get my Discover 3? And I believe the answer should be yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is going to turn the Soul Cauldron into a 5/4 creature, which is, a bit more useful than what it was being before, which was a artifact with no abilities.
Yeah, I don't love the sequencing there from Jody because he could have got no more light there, but seemed to be down for it. Does have a Kite Sail Larcenist come in, which will now turn that Tidebinder into a treasure. So he might have been waiting on the Mirex being like, hey, Steve, if you have no more lives, look, I don't have the mana. But, with your land being face up, and, Jody's a well-accomplished player, and one, maybe you could think it's like a oopsie poopsie, but I think for the most part, you can assume something's up there with Jody. Now I think we're checking to see, hey, if Tidebinder's a treasure, does it still get its ability because it's still on the battlefield?
Right. So Larcenist does make it lose all other abilities.
Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I guess we'll find out because I think Tashana gives the thing an ability. Like it isn't Tashana tied to it. It gave the ability to the Soul Cauldron of if I'm in play, you can't do your thing. I'm not 100% sure. And if it comes up, we have judges there. We can see the head judge coming over here to see something as well. So there might just be some confirmation going on.
Right. And looks like we are crewing the Subterranean Scooter with the Larcenist. And this is going to be a pretty big swing.
It's super close to lethal. We do have Restless Anchorage coming in. So we're going to see the attack here. So let's see. We got 5, 8, 10, 13. So I do believe it is exactly lethal here currently. Now, the Restless Anchorage can animate and block with impunity because, Jody has no mana up. So Jody knows he can't get across the finish line to win. So he's going to have to attack the Jace with some of the creatures and then Steve with the rest, leaving back the Wormlet. Doesn't want to throw it under the bus. So we're going to see an Explore happen. That's going to grow the Larcenist. And
yeah. Now, important note here is, the Soul Cauldron is a creature now, so the Sunfall will hit it. And Tidebinder is not a creature anymore, right?
Tidebinder is a treasure. Yeah, that's why it's back there.
So it would not get hit by the Sunfall, but would come back as a creature after the Larcenist?
I think so. That's my understanding of how it's going to work, which is actually really great for Steve, as the Act of the Soul Cauldron will be gone permanently, so we can then block with the Tidebinder, and we'll still have that body on board. And it looks like Steve's trying to figure out, am I supposed to, save my Jace and lose the land?
Right, and looks like we're going to go ahead and Field of Ruin, the Mirex down.
This is going to be a really weird turn coming up here where the Sunfall, like you mentioned, is going to kind of reset the board a bit, and Steve's going to get a huge token, and we've lost the Mirex, which was some of our grind potential. But I guess the real question is, does Zoetic Glyph say leave the battlefield or when the creature dies? Because we might...
Well, it's when Zoetic Glyph goes to the graveyard, right?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, when this is put into the graveyard. So it will still discover despite the exiling on Sunfall, which I'm curious if Steve is aware of, because that's some very interesting wording and interaction happening there.
Right. So going to get a 4 counters incubate token. Zoetic Glyph's going to hit the yard. We're going to start discovering. And It looks like that was a hard-hitting question, which will just have to go into Jody's hand.
Yeah, and Steve was just double checking, like, hey, your creature got exiled, and Jody's like, no, it's when this thing dies, and Steve's like, oh, no doubt, no doubt, no doubt.
Right. And just a quick little uptick on the Jace. And suddenly Steve is looking to be in a pretty good position, even being at 5 life.
Yeah. Not the worst spot ever. And Steve has 2 blockers, so you're not in fear of getting, like, hit with the schooner for a bunch this turn.
Yeah, also worth noting, Graveyard's starting to get pretty big. We're not too far off of Jace being able to draw Steve a bunch of cards and really refuel. Oh, but that is going to be a tough cookie. Pretty good get for Jody here. Gonna make a food. Can animate artifacts.
Yeah, tough cookie is one of the cards we called out. We even saw Steve mill Jody and luckily hit another cookie. So Steve was worried about this card, and now it's in play. And
oh, and then we're gonna see another Soul Cauldron.
That is massive.
Yeah, very massive, because this makes the 4/4 blocker a lot worse against the Schooner if we attack with it. So we can just pump it up to become a 4/5. It looks like Jody is crewing.
And it looks like we're going to try to remove, I think, the actual Jace. I think the question here is for Jody is like, should I just kill the Jace or kill the Tidebinder? And looks like Jody is just going to go for the actual Tidebinder.
Yeah, I like this a lot. Forces Steve to, if he wants to protect Jace, block with the Incubate, which will just become a chump whenever Jody activates the Soul Cauldron. So really, like, puts Steve in a very awkward spot. Oh, and that is a Surge Engine off the top, which Jody might be inclined to want to get into the yard as soon as possible.
Yeah, giving that activate ability of Surge Engine to the other creatures is so massive. The first one is it loses Defender and gains the can't be blocked text, which goes on those creatures. Those creatures are going to be able to be unblockable. And then there's a lot of other texts where they become bigger, and then you start drawing cards. But notably, the can't be blocked thing is massive here when there's an Incubate token involved. Now it looks like Jody's going to keep it on top and just wants the actual card before we get going in that regard. But a lot of options here. And this is part of the tough part of the tough cookie deck. You have a lot of spots where we've been talking about, like, oh, am I supposed to mill this? Or I need the actual card? Like, how do I navigate? And these high synergy, low raw power decks have these sort of things come up a lot, right? Like Jody's deck is a sum of its parts deck, unlike Steve's deck, which is just like kind of mono banger strong cards, tied together with some board wipes.
Yeah, and looks like Steve just letting the Jace die, doesn't want to just lose the Incubate token, and I think is going to activate it on the end step here.
Yeah, looks like Jody was double checking to see if there was anything he wanted to eat from Steve's graveyard with the mana tapped out, like maybe like a Memory Deluge got milled or something, but decides just to get rid of the Tashani Tidebinder and get the counter on the Schooner. So now that Schooner's going to be an even bigger problem as the game progresses forward.
Yep, and we are going to see the Incubate token get flipped here. And this game has had a ton of back and forth. It looks like another Sunfall might be what was in Steve's hand there.
Yeah, and it's Stunfall Anchorage, and really the problem for Steve is starting to become, how do I win this match? Because now this game has been going on for a while now. Now, part of that was, a little 2 or 3 minute judge call way to confirm some stuff. But even outside of that, these players are going to be running into the clock very soon. And you do not, getting a draw here is not like the end of the world, but you don't want one.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're on pace, and also Steve has this perfect no draw record against blue white. Steve might not want to be playing in the mirror all day, or the fabled toxic player in the draw bracket.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and looks like Surgeon is coming down, crewing the schooner immediately. I think we might be seeing a cookie activation. Yep, turning the food token into a 4/4 till end of turn.
I also want to highlight how different all these standard decks we've seen this round are, from a ramp deck to this like synergy artifacty deck to this sort of weird legends deck to a control deck. Standard has something for everyone right now, which is really exciting to see.
Yeah, very, very healthy format at the moment. So, like, whatever kind of deck you like to play, you can probably play it in standard competitively. And it looks like, a swing out from Jody. We're going to activate an anchorage here for Steve.
And I think Jody's blocks are, I'm sorry, I think Steve's blocks are forced because of Jody having the Agathas.
Yeah, I think he just has to block the 2 creatures that can kill him.
Yeah, and then now Jody gets to decide, do I want to push one more damage or eat this incubate token? Or am I down to trade it for my food? We can't get the fabled +1/+1 counter on a food, which will complete my bingo board. So pretty hyped for that. Oh no, Jody, I need that. All right, Jody just wants to take the trade. Understandable. He'd rather not let something like a deluge happen and or get a different ability if the game continues on.
Right. Yep, we're just gonna have to Sunfall here, which doesn't take care of the Cauldron, doesn't take care of the Subterranean Schooner, but it does a couple of important things. One, gives Steve a creature that he can block with. 2, exiles the Surge Engine. So, we're not about to have an unblockable threat out of nowhere. And we're going to see a Sentinel of the Nameless City come down for Jody. That's going to make a map token. And more importantly, give him a creature that he can crew the Subterranean Schooner with, which is going to force this jump from Steve.
Yeah, if you're a Steve fan, you're really hoping, Steve has something like the Wandering Emperor in hand right now that can answer this schooner, but we know that's not the case. And Jody is in a position where he can't play around it,
Yeah.
He just kind of has to attack in. Oh, there is a tough cookie in the graveyard from earlier in the game when we milled. So Jody does have access to start turning these creatures into cookies.
Right, yeah. And with that map token, wouldn't be able to attack this turn. But, there's a Get Lost for the Subterranean Schooner. That's pretty huge. Gonna go up to 3 map tokens for Jody, which to him might as well be 3 potential cookies. And look like we're gonna crack one on the Sentinel, get a Mirrex into hand. And looks like we're cracking another one. Seeing a Siren.
Yeah, I like the leaving of the Siren on top. I like the leaving the Mirrex in the hand and just sort of keeping the one last map in play. That way you can threaten. Looks like Jody's maybe thinking about playing it to have access to pop into the map and have a mana up. But I like this because all of your tokens, are going to be things that you can turn into cookies with your Soul Cauldron, and just making sure Steve doesn't, like deluge into like, I don't know, Field of Ruin plus an answer, right? Like that could be a way for Jody to lose. And Jody is dangerously close to closing this game out.
Right. Oh, and there is a Wandering Emperor, which is going to get to exile the Sentinel, which is kind of rare for your bingo card, given that that is a vigilant creature.
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't connect 5 in a row on that one, but it is opening up some new lines for my bingo, which I'm excited for. Steve, also, mana is a little spread apart. We do still have the Restless Anchorage activation available to us, but if we activate now, we're going to be dead on board to that, Spyglass Siren getting played, eat the cookie, turn the map into a 4/4 and attacking. If we attack with both it and the 2/2 token, we have to leave one of them back. So
Right.
Steve cannot get fully in here as much as maybe Steve would like to. We might just see the anchorage come in just so you get the map popping and try to like smooth your draw out.
Yeah, okay. So we got the map token. We're going to pop it onto the anchorage, which I like quite a bit. And there's the deluge that Steve has been looking for so long.
Yep, and Steve has to leave it on top. Sometimes you might see players bin it there because they're like, oh, I want to actually flash it back for 7, but Steve doesn't have the life total, doesn't have the mana for it, so just leaves it on top.
Yeah.
Makes a ton of sense. We're going to see Agatha's just eat the cookie, and we're going to put the creatures underneath the Soul Cauldron just to make sure that it's clear what activate abilities Agatha's Soul Cauldron has, because Lord knows it does a lot.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm sure Steve also does not want to expose the deluge in the graveyard to the Soul Cauldron. Spyglass Siren's going to come down, make a map token, and we're just going to exile a Wormlet, which is going to get the counter onto the Siren. So now it can activate the cookie ability and swing in for 4. Steve's going to, of course, not choose to lose the game here and instead jump with the 2/2 token that he has.
Yeah, Joey's an interesting spot. Could play the Mirrex here because it weirdly has a lot of uses for the mana. But once again, I kind of like holding it and playing it. It's really tough because like your tough cookie eats a decent amount of your mana. So like if you play the Mirrex now, maybe you can get Mirrex plus a cookie activation. But once again, maybe that Mirrex getting sniped before you get to activate it is one of the ways you lose this game, which feels really hard to lose. So might as well hold it,
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, if he plays the next turn, he's got the mana for Mirrex plus cookie activation, I believe.
It does, but not the double cookie, which honestly Jody might need in the case of the Wandering Emperor.
Yeah, absolutely. Looks like we're going to see the deluge from Steve here. I saw a Sunfall for sure, maybe also a Tidebinder.
Yeah, there is a Sunfall and a Tidebinder, but notably if Steve, so Steve can go Sunfall here and then have, whatever other card left in hand, can turn the Wandering Emperor into a Samurai, and then Jody, even if he draws a land, can go play Mirrex, activate, make a 1/1, give it a counter with Agatha's, turn one of those things into a tough cookie, and attack and force the jump block. So Steve hit the card that he kind of needs, but, it's just really a matter of can we stay alive because Jody is keeping the pressure up. And if something else comes down, like, some way to remove the blocker from Jody, like one of his 1-mana fight spells, that could be game over.
Right. But we definitely do want to deal with this Siren to keep Jody from being able to just double cookie those map tokens next turn. Really awkward spot here.
Yeah, it looks like Steve went with a Tidebinder plus another card. It might be Tidebinder plus Killspell. I can't get a good look at it. If it is Tidebinder plus Killspell, I imagine we're going to start with Tidebindering now.
Right. So Tidebinder now will shut off all the abilities of the Siren, which would include all the abilities it's getting from the Soul Cauldron. But I think in response to this, Jody could activate again.
Yeah,
looks like that is what's happening.
Oh, excuse me. Tough Cookie is 3 mana. My line was not available to Jody last turn. Pardon on that. But Jody does get to activate here, and notably the Siren loses flying too. So when we attack, you don't get to attack in for free with the Siren.
Right.
It will trade.
Yeah, very important. So we've got a 4/4 coming in. We're just going to chump it with the Samurai.
Yeah, I wonder what that last card was for Steve. I haven't got a good look at it yet. Maybe it's something like the Wandering Emperor that can help stabilize from here. Because now, Jody doesn't have any more cookie activations. Does now have the line available I mentioned last turn of activating and then activating Cookie. I forgot Cookie was 3 mana, not 2 mana. It costs 2 to cast, believe it or not. I've not cast a lot of Tough Cookie.
Yeah, I mean, Steve's in a precarious position against a deck like Cookies, which can kind of just blitz out a lot of damage out of nowhere sometimes. I mean, honestly, like a huge draw for Jody is, just one of the 1-mana creatures. Just get something down that you can put a counter on and then activate Tough Cookie twice.
Yep. It looks like Steve is asking, hey, if Jody activates again, does the new counter re-grant the abilities to the Spyglass, meaning that the Tough Cookie could be activated again?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think it does, but I don't know. This is why we have judges.
Yep.
This is such a tricky position. Steve really taking his time to figure out how he wants to play this. Going to play a tapped land, and it looks like it's just going to pass from there.
Yeah, it doesn't look like Steve wants to risk to just put a counter on the Siren, so it becomes a 3/3, and then it becomes a 4/4. But it looks like Jody instead is going to go and fight over the Deluge, which I like. It forces Steve to either tap out if he wants the Deluge right now, or lose the Deluge. And we talked about how Deluge is kind of how Steve's going to get back into this game.
Yeah, it looks like deciding to go ahead and tap out for the Deluge, maybe just hoping to hit a kill spell that he can cast. I mean, gets to look at a lot of cards.
Didn't quite make out what they were.
No, not sure what he's got there.
Oh, Steve, no way. Our camera. Okay, so it looks like Lance. We have Memory Deluge, Agancho, and Field of Ruin.
Yeah, that's not gonna do it. I mean, right now, I guess Steve's not dead to just Mirrex activation Tough Cookie.
But what about
Ginger Brew? I mean, like I was saying before, just any 1-drop enables the line of, and I mean, with Ginger Brute, that's such a good one to get, because now you're also just swinging for 2 that Steve's not going to be able to block.
Yeah, I think what Jody's going to do here is activate the Agathas like you talked about. Going to put the counter on the Ginger Brute.
Mm-hmm.
Then we're going to play our land. I guess we already have the 3 mana we need, so we don't really need to play the Merrics. We're going to turn these maps into 4/4s, and we just have a bunch of lethal attackers, and that's going to do it. Jody Keith wins game number 1.
Wow. Simic Cookies taking down the first game, and what a game that was. I mean, so much back and forth, so many moments where it felt like Jody was clearly ahead, and then, it felt like Steve had definitely taken the upper hand, just going back and forth like crazy. So what did we think about this sideboard, Mason? What do you think Jody might want to bring in, take out?
Yeah, so Spell Pierce we're going to definitely want to bring in. This is a card that is going to be really good in our deck. Hard-hitting Question, we saw line up really well for Jody in those games in a couple spots, but is typically a pretty dead card. Jody's going to want to take that out. Tashana's Tidebinder is a card Jody could bring in as well if he wants to continue playing that flash game. That's something that, also can stop the Planeswalkers. So I'm curious to see if Jody wants to do that. Cryptic Coat we saw just be very strong here. Tezzeret maybe as a card for this. Typically, players turn to Planeswalkers in spots where your opponent's trying to kill everything. I'd be curious to know if that one is good enough in this matchup. And then Haywire Might is just a great way to answer some cards like Temporary Lockdown for Jody here. So definitely going to see that one brought in.
Yeah, let's take a quick look back over at Steve's list, and let's just talk for a second about what you think he wants to bring in against this Cookies deck.
So, I mean, for sure, Temporary Lockdown, that's a must. And then, honestly, now we have about 11 minutes left in the round. When the players got up, we could see the match clock in the background there as we went to the sideboards. And that means Steve, if he wants to win this round, needs to win the games, which means we need to bring in things like the Sphinx, like the Chrome Host Seed Shark, the Dust Animus. I think you would want all these kind of cards anyways, Tashana's Tidebinder, just to win the game. But I think Steve needs to play a much more tempo-based game and be like, slam a thing, protect the thing, kill you. That is what Steve needs to do. And I think we're going to have to do that if we're going to want to win game 2 and 3 here before the round and the time is up.
All right, well, game 2 is ready. Let's get into it. Let's see how these players did and how they're going to approach this second game, where we are going to have Steve on the play. Like you said, just a little bit of time left in the round. Game 1 going as long as it did. And we're just going to see a tapped land pass and then the creature land for Jody. Players are obviously playing very quickly. They want to get through their games as well. And it's going to be a Surge Engine on turn 2 for Jody here.
Yeah, this card is kind of nice. We didn't see it much in game number 1, despite seeing so much in game number 1. But this is something that, can turn on, start getting in some damage, and the late game starts drawing you a lot of cards. Probably aren't going to see the late game stuff happen in this match, but could happen.
Yep. And we are going to see Steve attempt to march the Surge Engine, but it is going to get Spell Pierced. And we're just going to go back over to Jody, who looks like missed a land drop on turn 3.
Yep. Looks to have picked one up this turn, but Jody bringing in the cards like Spell Pierce came in very clutch there and allowed him to keep the pressure up. This is what Jody needs to not only win the game, but to make sure Steve does not, have a chance to develop something of his own as a threat.
Right, going to attempt to get lost, and in response to that get lost, we are going to see a Repulsive Mutation.
Mm-hmm. Repulsive Mutation is one of those interesting counterspells. Sometimes you can, be a bit of a liability, but also is a great way just to have some more cheap answers for these creature-y decks that want to have counter magic.
Right, and Jody just going straight to swinging in against Steve once more. Already has him down to, I think, 11 life.
That sounds about right to me. And Jody now has 3 mana available to him. And we saw from his hand has cards like Tidebinder, has some tough cookies, has plenty of things that we can do, and decides to play the Cryptic Coat.
Yeah, now that is going to go ahead and get counterspelled by a 3 steps ahead, which I think is also going to let us draw 2, discard a card. And then Steve going to main phase the Emperor to finally exile and take care of that Surge Engine there.
I love this main phase tap out from Steve. Jody's hand is all spells, right? Miss some land drops. That there's cards like Spell Pierce in the deck. Might as well kill this and force Jody to tap out, because these games where we start tapping out at one another can actually favor Steve when Jody is tight on mana.
Yep, and we're going to see a Sentinel come down for Jody. That's going to make a map token, and that's going to be it for him on that turn. And looks like a Seed Shark for Steve, which we're going to uptick the Emperor to give it a +1/+1 counter.
Pretty big play there, as now it is a 3/5.
Oh, but a Pick Your Poison when Steve only has the 1 flying creature. That's going to deal with the shark easily and open up the Emperor to getting attacked.
Yeah, we see Jody sort of say, hey, combat, Now Steve has cards like Tashani's Tidebinder that he could flash in, but looks like he wanted to save that, which makes sense. By the way, Jody's hand is stacked with cards that matter between, we have a Schooner, another Pick Your Poison, a Jide. So lots of options available to Jody there.
Do you think there's any world where Steve might have wanted to activate that Anchorage and lose it to the Pick Your Poison?
Possibly, but if we do lose that land and Steve's deck is so mana hungry that it's possible Steve was just valuing having the ability to do something like this plus have a No More Lies available. Mm-hmm. It's a tough line to choose too, because if Jody has something else that removes it or like wins the fight, then you're down so many resources.
Yeah, and it looks like it's going to be a tough cookie for Jody, which we're going to make a food. We're going to crew the Schooner, swing in. There's going to be a Tidebinder on top.
Yeah, and we know Jody already has one of those. I'm curious to see if Jody wants to have another. Notably, it's nice to have a real spell that matters, but if you do bin it, Steve might play into your Tidebinder, but you might also flood out and lose the game, so it's a really tough spot. Jody just valuing having the raw cardboard, which I think I'm in line with right here.
Right, and here we are going to see the Sunken Citadel Coming down for Steve. We're going to field one of the creature lands, which is going to shuffle away that Tidebinder.
This is Demolition Field. Yeah, this is actually a May effect for Jody. Jody could have kept it on top had he wanted to. He realized after he picked up his deck, though. So unfortunately for Jody, you could not search if you wanted to out of principle, but you'll be down the land. Might as well get the base.
Right.
And these players are gaming. We have a judge you can see there on the left and on the right now coming over, the purple shirts. They are watching for the clock. They're keeping up with things.
Yep. And after that Demolition Field, I mean, this is such a tough position for Steve. Looks like passing it back over to Jody, who's been able to hit land drops very consistently. Going to activate the Tough Cookie's ability, turn that food into a 4/4. And is going to play the Lost GTA.
Yeah, now is looking to maybe use it. And this is one of the nice things we talked about with the Cookies deck earlier, right? It's a deck that has the ability to like play underneath counter spells and attack the board still, and be a deck that uses all its mana. So
right. So Tidebinder on the Subterranean Schooner activation, keep it from becoming a creature. Gonna equip the 4/4 with the Jite, which we're going to just chump with our 1/1 incubate token, which will still get a counter. And yeah, that should become detached now as the food is no longer a creature. But as you mentioned earlier, we can still activate those Lost Jite abilities. And, you know, as you mentioned in the first game, now that we have sideboarded, that could mean that Jody is representing Spell Pierce at any time.
Yeah, so Steve has to be a little aware of that. We saw one Spell Pierce get used, so that's good news for Steve. But, you know, Jody, you also know, had all lands. I'm sorry, had all spells for about 5 turns there, as we missed a couple of land drops. So, you know, Jody's hand is pretty packed to the brim. So it does look like we're going to get in and get exploring with the map.
Ooh. Oh, and then a temporary lockdown on the top there. If Steve can get to that, that could be a huge card if it resolves.
We see Jody tap the top of his deck. Botanical Sanctum, clearly what he was meaning for the tap there. Congratulations for him having manifested that.
Now, Jody does have that Tidebinder in hand.
Looks like we're equipping the Lost Jitty.
And we are reactivating, turning our food into a 4/4. And I think we just swing out here.
Yes, Steve can trade here, but if he does, you know, that temporary lockdown is going to be a lot less effective. Jody can just make it so the Tidebinder can't block and actually push damage, which I think is a fairly reasonable play. You know, the Tidebinder is still being played, but Jody has a creature land. Seems like they asked the judge a question there.
Lost. Yeah. And it looks like Steve just taking it, going down to 3, I believe.
Oh, and this is the turns counter, I believe. Now, worth noting here, Jody still has that pick your poison from forever ago. Some of these things are going to come back. Some aren't, because a lot of the things on the board are tokens. But notably, you know, the Tough Cookie and the Schooner will. And the Schooner will no longer be got by it. But, oh, we have to show a Sidebinder.
Yeah, so using 2 of the counters from the Lost Jite is able to untap 2 lands, cast the Tidebinder to counter the triggered ability from Lockdown, and Steve just has no answer for it. And that is going to be Jody Keith, our winner with the Tough Cookies deck. That was incredible. Mason, what do you think about that match we just saw?
That was a slug fest from start to finish. I mean, that really showed off the power of the Tough Cookies deck, its ability to play these longer games and not give up. Used all of its mana very well. Also, a testament to the blue-white control deck. It's very good, and if it finds Memory Deluges, it's like almost like a pioneer power level deck, right? Like if you look at those two decks, they're very similar in the cards that they are playing. But unfortunately, for our blue-white control player, we just didn't draw the Memory Deluge until we were on like turn 30 of that game one. And so a matchup that could go easily either way if they were to play it, 100 times. But wow, what a match we got to see, and a lot of high level play happening the whole time.
Right. And congratulations to Jody. Really impressive display from both players. Just really, really strong gameplay. Now we are going to have a giveaway from our sponsors at Heavy Play. So I believe you just need to type the words Heavy Play in chat for a chance to win $5 in store credit at heavyplay.com. And of course, while you're there, you can get 10% off of your order using the code Dallas2024. Heavy Play, really great company. Mason, I know you've used their products a bit. What do you think?
Yeah, I really like the ETB playmat. That is a nice playmat with it has the mag equip system on it, so you can connect your dice box, you can connect your deck box to it as well, and sort of just carry it around. It's very nice. You can go to heavyplay.com and they have videos kind of showing you how it goes. And if you've been watching the coverage, you've seen some of those demos in between rounds. Check it out. It might be the right thing for you. And just a huge shout out to Heavy Play for helping support coverage of this regional championship.
Yeah, thank you, Heavy Play. Now we are going to have just a quick break, and then we are going to get right back into our next round of Magic. I'm hyped to see it. I know you are as well, Mason. We'll be back just in a bit.